Have you ever had a moment with your child where you completely lose it? Okay, where you're yelling, your body feels out of control, and it's like something takes you over. And then just minutes later, you're sitting there thinking, what is wrong with me? If you're parenting a PDA or autistic child, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. The long days of co regulating, the constant demands, the pressure to stay calm, and then suddenly you snap. And what makes it even harder isn't just the rage that you go into, it's what comes after: the shame, the guilt, the fear that you're damaging your child, and the promise you make to yourself, next time I'll do better. But then it happens again, and you start to wonder, why does this keep happening? Why does it feel so intense? And why can't I seem to control it? So, in this episode, I want to show you something really important. This is not personal failure. This is not because something is wrong with you. This is a nervous system pattern. And once you understand what's actually happening underneath your rage, you can begin to work with it in a completely different way. Not by trying harder to control yourself, but by understanding the cycle, building capacity, and learning how to move through that energy safely. So, if you've ever found yourself stuck in this rage, shame, repeat loop, this episode is going to help you make sense of it and, more importantly, help you begin to change it. So, let's begin. Okay, I remember one night so clearly. It had been a long day of co regulating my son, and we were in a phase where we were trying out low demand parenting and offering a lot of accommodations to help him stay regulated. And while I could understand why this approach was needed, my nervous system often felt completely taxed by it. So all day I was trying to stay calm, trying to meet his needs, trying to hold everything together. And there were moments where he would escalate, like he would start banging things and becoming more intense. And I would feel my body startle, but I would just hold it all in. I would keep functioning, keep going, trying to get through the day. Underneath it all, okay, I felt pushed. I felt like I had no power in this situation. Okay. I felt like he was pushing me. And if I'm really honest, I also felt fear. Okay. I was scared of his escalations, that they could become so extreme at times. We had things in the house being damaged, and TVs and expensive things and episodes lasting for hours. And my system had learned to just keep accommodating in order to prevent it from getting worse. Okay. So that night I was doing the best that I could. And then bedtime came around, and he didn't want me to sleep. He wanted me to stay with him longer. At the time, he was staying up later and later. So this was becoming a real challenge. So I stayed with him. But then it was 1 a.m. and then it was 2 a.m. And I was trying to stay calm, trying so hard, right? Like, calm, just be calm, just be calm, just be calm. But inside, something was building. I didn't want to be controlled, and I wanted to sleep. But at the same time, I felt so much pressure to be what he needed. Okay. It felt like all of his demands and all that pressure had been building inside of me all day long. And then he threw a glass bottle and it shattered across the floor. And there I was at 2 a.m., completely exhausted, having to clean it up. And something in me just snapped. I lost it. I yelled. I made those ugly animal-like growling faces. I could feel the rage completely take over my body. And then, just like always, I would collapse into a pile of shame, hating my life, but more than anything, hating myself for not being able to control this reaction. Okay, so this is the cycle that so many parents get stuck in. Okay, one of the hardest things to work through as a parent is the shame spiral that follows moments like this. Okay, because what we experience in those moments is not just frustration or even anger. It is this intense fight energy that can feel completely out of control. Okay. It could feel like you have lost yourself, like you're gone, right? Like you are behaving in ways that don't match who you want to be or your values. And in those moments, it can genuinely feel like you have become someone else, right? Like you're taken over, someone you don't recognize. And then the aftermath comes, the shame, the self-judgment, the belief that something is wrong with you. Many of us, okay, have been conditioned to believe that being a good, worthy, respectable human being means being in control of our emotions. Okay, this is deep, deep conditioning. So when we find ourselves acting in ways that feel out of control, it doesn't just feel like a bad moment. It feels like a reflection of who we are. So then we try to fix it, right? We go into fixing mode. We tell ourselves we need to try harder. We clamp down more on the anger. We push it, we try to push it away. And for a while, it may seem like it's working, right? Temporarily. But underneath, the pressure is building because what we are doing is trying to control something that is not meant to be controlled, instead of understanding what is actually happening and learning how to work with it. And so then the cycle continues on repeat. Okay. So let's take a moment to understand like what is happening in your nervous system, right? When this rage comes up, this anger and rage. So from a nervous system perspective, okay, anger and rage are not a personality flaw or a mental health challenge. Okay. So this is important to understand because we may often think that something is wrong with us because we can't break out of the cycle. But this, from a nervous system perspective, it's really defensive reactions, okay, that happen automatically when the system detects danger and cannot resolve it through connection, or what's called our social engagement system. Okay, so if you think of like any challenge in life, something stresses us out, we first try to solve that stressor through our more regulated system, our more connected state, which is our social engagement system. And we'll try to talk calmly maybe to our child. We'll try to reason with them. We'll try to help them. We'll try to co-regulate. We'll try to solve the problem. But then that doesn't work. And something begins to shift internally, right? You get even more triggered. The nervous system starts to register that this situation is not resolving through this method of social engagement. And at some level, it begins to feel unsafe, okay? Because something that's deeper inside is getting triggered. And at that point, the system then moves into survival responses and it starts to mobilize all of this energy to either fight or to flee. Okay, so this is a natural part of everyone's nervous system, and you're always going to have fight or flight responses if you feel like you cannot solve the problem that's happening in front of you from a social engagement state. Okay, but this is where parenting creates a unique bind here, okay? You cannot flee because this is your child, and you do not want to fight your child either, right? So then the system does something very important. It overrides those impulses and it goes into a freeze response, okay? To clamp down basically and shut down the fight flight impulses. So this freeze response, okay, and the outside, it could look calm, like it's a state of holding it together, right? But it's not calm, okay? It's clamping down and it's trying to contain all of that fight and flight energy inside the body. So you keep going, right? You keep functioning, you keep holding it all in, but that energy, it doesn't go away. It builds and it builds and it builds. And when the system can no longer contain that level of activation, okay, and freeze it down, it shifts into what we can call a defensive rage mode. Okay, so defensive rage, it's a last attempt to resolve the perceived threat and restore safety, restore agency again, okay, and restore power again in the system. Okay, so it feels very fast and it feels very out of control, right? That's what most parents say. Like, okay, this just came out of nowhere. Like, I thought I was calm and then boom, I was not. Okay, but what is actually happening is the opposite. The system has been holding and holding for a long time, okay? Because you are in freeze and clamping down on the anger that's building inside, you are not fully feeling the buildup in your body, right? Because of that freeze response on top. The energy is being clamped down and then it's outside of your conscious awareness. And this can become very habitual, right? Meaning like a habit, like something that just becomes part of our system and then we don't notice. Okay. So then when that energy builds and we don't feel it, and then it finally breaks through, it feels like it's sudden. Okay. It feels that way. But in reality, it has been building underneath the surface, but we just haven't been noticing. Okay. This is why it can feel so intense and so fast, because it's not just the moment, it is the accumulation of everything that has been held in. It's kind of like, a volcano erupting, right? You can imagine that. So, and when it releases, it can feel momentarily relieving too. Okay. This is what a lot of, like, you get these endorphins coming in and it can feel momentarily relieving to get that fight energy out. And there can be this sense of like power, right? Or this discharge of energy that feels almost good, or even for some people, euphoric for a brief moment, right? Because you're able to get that fight response out. But then that is quickly followed by a drop into shutdown, okay, into shame, collapse, and self-judgment. Okay, so let's understand, the deeper stuff that's getting triggered behind this rage and trauma, right? And this is really the role of trauma and past experiences. So this pattern becomes even more intense in the present moment. Okay. And I would say that if it's really intense, if you're having a very intense rage or anger response, it's almost always due to past trauma being triggered underneath it. Okay. So when your system feels like it cannot fight or flee and the freeze state gets triggered to hold it all in, then this often mimics earlier traumatic life experiences of powerlessness and no escape and no choice. Okay, so what happens is that younger child experiences of yours get triggered, and those were experiences where you couldn't say no, where you felt trapped, where you had no choice, okay, where you were not heard and you were not safe. Okay, so in those moments, your fight or flight responses were not able to complete, right? You had these impulses to fight or flight as a child, to fight or flee, but you couldn't complete them. Okay. And that means all that energy of that high charge got bound up in your system, right? It remains in the system. Okay. So then when your current situation, like your child's behavior, recreates a similar internal feeling state, okay, then the nervous system does not just respond to the present moment, it's responding to the past getting triggered as well. That's why it can feel so big, right? So then it tries to protect you from feeling those same overwhelming emotions of the past, okay, as well as it's trying to complete the defensive responses of fight or flight, but in this case, fight, that never got to finish. Okay. And this is why the reaction can feel so disproportionate to what's actually happening in the present and so overwhelming. Okay. So that's important to understand about that trauma that gets triggered. And then, anger and rage, it's also important to understand that anger and rage, they're not only just fight responses, they are also protective of something deeper. Okay. They often show up to protect us from feeling the more vulnerable emotions underneath. And again, that comes from a lot of those vulnerable emotions come from the trauma of the past, but it can also come from, the experience of loss and parenting a child with high needs. Okay. So what happens is, like, for many of us, it's much easier to feel anger than it is to feel deep grief and sadness or shame, right? Or fear or even terror, right? That can come from past traumatic experiences that are getting triggered. So the rage and the anger and the rage becomes this kind of shield, right? It protects us from having to fully experience those deeper, more vulnerable layers. Okay. So the less tolerance and capacity that we have for those deeper, vulnerable emotions getting triggered, then the more we will experience anger to protect us from feeling them. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through my own patterns beneath the rage, okay, that I was experiencing to help you understand this. So for me, like my rage was deeply connected to earlier experiences in my life where I felt that I was unable to say no because, I had to be a good little girl who was always compliant in order to get love and approval. Okay. Um, or earlier experiences where I felt trapped and without choice, okay, which we often feel this in childhood, right? Just being a child, you often have no choice and you can feel trapped. But that also came for me from my earlier traumas. And for me, there was this feeling of like I was going to die, right? When I was pushed and pushed and pushed to the edge by my son, what seemed like I was being pushed by my son, and I couldn't say no. It felt like I was going to die. And I had this near death experience at 1 years old, which was being triggered within this. Okay. And then the rage would come out to protect. Other experiences that were connected to my rage where I was ashamed. I had a lot of shame about my anger, okay, because of the messaging that I got when I was angry as a child, okay. The messaging we all get when we're angry as a child is that it's not okay, right? And that it's shameful. And then also the experience of feeling unheard and powerless. And some of this came from medical trauma or a couple of medical traumas that I experienced in childhood, okay, where with anesthesia and stuff, I won't go into the details here. So when my son's behavior created this sense of pressure, okay, of being demanded of, okay, of not having space, of not being able to say no, my system would respond in a very specific way. First, I would freeze and I would hold it in, hold it in, hold it in, and eventually it would explode into a big rage. And at the time, I didn't understand why my reactions felt so extreme or why they seemed to take over so suddenly. But what I came to understand was this, okay? There was nothing wrong with me, okay? My system was doing exactly what it had learned to do to protect me. So that same past pattern comes up today, okay? When you might say, I didn't have that past pattern when I was a child. Well, it is the pattern that wanted to come out to protect you, okay? And then that comes out today with our children, okay? And that past pattern is trying to protect me from overwhelming emotional states, that's trying to protect me today from overwhelming emotional states of the past. And at the same time, it's trying to complete the defensive responses that were never allowed to finish, okay? That fight response of fighting back. So then the system feels like, oh, okay, I completed that. I'm back to safety. Okay. So this is why this defensive rage can really come out. Okay. So the shift, that needed to happen for my system, okay, was moving from trying to control this anger to instead building capacity to be with this anger and intense rage energy. Okay. So the shift really came when I stopped trying to control my anger and started learning how to work with it. Okay. Because this is not something that changes through like willpower or discipline. Okay. Because that's just another, like, I feel like a way of controlling, right? It changes through building capacity in the nervous system to feel these intense emotions and energy and stay with it, okay, while bringing cues of safety and choice to it, okay, so that you don't go into freeze and that you can instead work with the fight energy and help it release. Okay, so let's get into what helps to break free from chronic anger and rage patterns, okay? And I want to mention, like, this is a process that is layered and took some time. Okay. And first, I had to learn how to come back into my body, okay, to notice sensations, to build what's called interoception, which is the ability to notice and interpret signals that are coming from the body. Okay. So before that, I was often disconnected from my body, right? I wasn't aware of what was building inside of me until it was already too much because I had this freeze response coming in, automatically feeling like it's too much to feel whatever's building in here, and it would clamp down and freeze it. So I had to go back to really learning to be in my body and develop the skills of interoception first. Okay. And I feel like this is what most people don't understand, right? We think that we can rely on these quick hacks to stop the rage. Like, okay, just give me a tool, just give me a hack. Like, let me just hack into this and have this, quick tool to like get rid of my rage, right? But the challenge is that if you can't feel what's happening in your body as this, and you can't feel that stress that is building, right? You'll miss the early signals. And by the time you notice it, you're already overwhelmed. And it's much harder to work with that bigger energy than it is to work with the smaller energy and catch it earlier. So this skill of interoception is really needed, right? And becoming more comfortable being in your body and feeling what's there. And this is really foundational to this work. Okay. So then I had to build tolerance, right? So once I could feel and be in my body, I had to build tolerance, which is the ability to be with, intense, uncomfortable sensations and emotions without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down, right? Without my nervous system going into freezing it and not feeling it again. I had to feel it, but then build tolerance to be with it for longer periods of time. And tolerance is a key part of becoming a regulated human, okay? But what many of us do instead is try to replace tolerance with control. Okay, so we clamp down on it. We try to control it by clamping down on it, suppressing it. We override what we feel. And while that may look like control on the outside, okay, internally, it's actually building more pressure in the system. So it's important to understand the difference, okay? Tolerance allows the energy to be felt and moved, and control tries to shut it down and contain it. And over time, control is what leads to explosion. Okay. And then the other thing I had to do was really change my relationship with anger itself. Okay. Through psychoeducation, through self-compassion, and a lot of self-forgiveness. Okay. I began to see that anger was not something to be ashamed of. And it was not something that defined me, right? It came from a nervous system state. It's not who I truly am. So a big part of this work was learning how to stay with this intense energy of anger or rage, okay? The urges to yell, to grab, to react without acting them out on my child. Okay, so that was another part of this work, right? Staying with the intense energy that's coming up, and all of these urges and impulses that want to act out on your child, but staying with them, okay, and redirecting that energy instead of acting them out on your child. Okay, so instead of clamping down on that energy, I learned how to let it move safely through my body. Okay, and this was a huge shift, and I've seen this be a huge shift for many parents in the Regulation Rebuild course that I teach. Okay, because the goal here is not to get rid of the anger. It's to work with the energy, okay, so that it doesn't have to come out in harmful ways. So at the same time, I had to learn to also support the more vulnerable emotions underneath, right? Because when those emotions that are getting triggered beneath this protective defensive rage and anger reaction, like the emotions like grief and shame and fear, powerlessness, and for me, there was even terror in there, okay? When those emotions are held with safety and they feel seen and supported, then the rage doesn't need to come out as strongly. And over time, the intensity of the rage decreased significantly for me. Okay. And then, perhaps most importantly, I began to rebuild a felt sense of choice, okay, to feel in my body that I was not trapped. I had agency. I could say no. I could work with this fight energy and help it out in safe ways, right? And that shift alone of feeling like I had choice in this matter changed how my nervous system responded in these moments. Okay. So let's get into what this looks like in real life, right? So in real life, okay, this meant learning to catch activation earlier. This is so important, okay? And this is like a big learning along this process, right? Of trying to become a more regulated parent is catching activation earlier. So noticing the frustration or the pressure building, the urge to say no before it builds into something that's so overwhelming, and then that becomes way harder to work with. Okay, so at those earlier stages of the anger building, right, I would notice it and I would work with the energy. And I would, if I felt like I wanted to say no but couldn't, I would push my arms against a wall. Okay, do like a push-up motion against the wall while imagining saying no, no. I couldn't say this out loud sometimes in front of my son. So you can even like imagine saying it or just like mouth it, right? Just to help get that energy out. But, a lot of fight energy is in the arms a lot of the time, or it can be in the legs. So like just pushing and trying to get that out against the wall, and helping my body feel that sense of a boundary, right? That I felt like I couldn't make with my child because it would escalate him more. So at the time I worked with it this way. And then I would do a full body shake off at times, right? Or I would feel my feet grounded on the floor and orient, what's called orienting, noticing and naming things in the room, just to give my system the sense that I was safe in the present, right? Because remember, what's getting activated is from the past. So you want to give your system the felt sense of, no, I'm in the present here. I'm safe, right? I'm safe. Okay, and then when the activation got too big, I would either use tools like I just mentioned to help discharge the energy from the body, or I would use like distraction techniques to help my frontal lobe come back online and stop engaging in the survival story that was feeding the reaction, right? So what I would do is I would grab an ice pack, okay? And this is a very common thing that you can do for rage. It activates ice on the face, kind of like jars you out of and interrupts the pattern and helps shift your state. It can also activate the vagus nerve, cold therapy, So I would do that. I would tell my husband, grab the ice pack so that to help me. I would do full body shake-offs, okay? And while I was moving my body, I would help my frontal lobe to disengage from the amygdala, the fight fear response that was going on. And I would name a letter I would name an animal for each letter of the alphabet, okay, while like doing a shake off, just to help my brain to come out of the loop, but also help my body to release the energy, okay? I would also like make this boo sound, right? It sounds like a foghorn, boo, right? And until it was all out to activate my vagus nerve and help get some of that like yelling energy out, or the urge to say no out. And if you can't do that out loud, you can even whisper it, or you can imagine yourself doing it, right? If you're staying in the room with your child. Okay, so the key here was staying out of the story and working with the body, because the body is the faster pathway to helping the nervous system feel safe again. Okay, that felt sense, that's the 80% pathway, okay, to the brain. The mind down is only the 20% pathway. So work with the bigger pathway, the body. So over time, this helped my system learn that there was another way to move through these states, okay, that I was not stuck and that I had options. Okay, the other thing, okay, as I continued to this work, with working with the anger and rage from a body-based, level, I had to work with the deeper meanings and beliefs that were underneath, right? And driving and fueling this whole nervous system response that was happening. Okay. So I had to work with those meanings that my mind was making. And for me, there was this deep internal conflict I was living in. That if I gave my son what he needed, I felt like I was losing myself, right? And the feeling of losing myself would trigger that rage, okay, because it connected to my past trauma. And if I gave myself what I needed, then I would feel like he would suffer, okay? And then that would trigger something else inside of me. And then this created this constant sense of being trapped, okay, because of this internal bind. So part of my healing was learning to step out of that internal bind and reconnect with a sense of choice and recognizing that both of us mattered, right? Like I could meet his needs and my needs. I didn't have to lose myself, and he didn't have to suffer. Okay. I also had to work with the beliefs about what my son's challenges meant about my life, right? Beliefs that my life was over, that everything had been taken from me, that I couldn't be successful in life if he was this way, right? Failure, failure, failure. I had to work with all of that and change those meanings, instead of like meanings of loss to meanings of what am I gaining from this journey, right? So slowly I started to shift those meanings and find more space for purpose, for growth. Like, how am I growing? How am I learning from this, right? What am I gaining from these challenging experiences instead of what I was just losing? So this helped me to turn my pain into purpose and feel even more empowered on this journey. Okay, then another part of this was really embracing compassion instead of punishment of self, right? So this was really important, right? Because to change the deeper patterns that fuel anger and rage, it's really about also learning how to meet yourself with compassion instead of punishment. Okay. And I had to do this because the truth is that on this path, like you will get triggered, right? And there will be moments where you lose it. Now, as you work with yourself and as you heal the past patterns, it gets way, way better, right? And you don't lose it, or the losing it becomes like minimal compared to before. Okay. But getting triggered and activated is part of this process. When you're triggered a lot by your child, right? There's a lot going on. So when it does happen, what matters most is not focusing on what just happened and why did you lose it, but it's more focusing on what happens next. And for me, this meant learning how to turn toward myself with compassion instead of turning against myself with judgment. Okay. And to understand that what just happened was a nervous system response, right? That due to feeling incredibly unsafe from all my past traumas that were getting triggered, right? And not a reflection of my worth as a parent or as a human being, right? So as I started to feel a lot of this activation within me and understand it was past trauma, I would often tell my son, what I was feeling and that it had nothing to do with him and that it was my own past trauma and that I'm just going to work with it. And that I'll be okay. I'm right here for him. Okay. So the key is not to stay stuck in the shame, because when we stay stuck in the shame and self-judgment and punishment, we don't actually change the pattern, we reinforce it. And we keep the nervous system in a state of threat, which makes it more likely that the cycle will repeat. Okay. But when we bring compassion, even after the hardest moments, we create the conditions for the nervous system to settle, to repair, to come back to safety. Okay. And that is what begins to break the cycle too. Okay. So where do you begin? If you are in this pattern, okay, start first with awareness. Okay. Try to build some interoception. Okay. And interoception skills of being in the body and noticing when the activation begins to build. Catch it earlier if you can. See if you can pause. Okay. Drop the story. Forget about what your mind is saying right now. And for a moment, just bring your attention to your body. And then you'll notice the activation building. And from there, just allow some movement, right? Move like in a gentle, intentional way that helps the energy to shift without overwhelming the system. Okay. So this might look like things I've already mentioned here, like doing a full body shake off, pushing against the wall, making a growling or a boo sound to get some of that yelling energy out, or even using simple distraction techniques, right? With movement, along with movement to interrupt the escalation, right? Like what I mentioned, like naming an animal or a food for each letter of the alphabet, just anything to help get your frontal lobe back online. Okay. So, and then work with the energy, not trap it in and hold it in. So the goal is not to get rid of the energy, okay, but to help your system move through it safely and help it to discharge from the body while re-engaging your higher thinking brain, which is your frontal lobe, to come back online. Okay, so if you're feeling really guilty and ashamed of your anger and rage episodes toward your child, I get it. Okay, I've been there too. You've heard it from this podcast. Okay, and I want you to really take this in. There is nothing wrong with your anger. Okay, there is nothing wrong with your rage. It makes sense. It is your nervous system trying to protect you. And when you begin to understand it and work with it instead of against it, the pattern can begin to change. Okay. And I also want to say that this is not about becoming a perfectly calm parent either. Okay. It's about rebuilding a nervous system with more capacity, more flexibility, more choice, more support that you can bring to yourself so that you can meet the reality of your life with greater steadiness and choice, right? And this is something that can be learned. And if you want to learn it, come join my Regulation Rebuild course, okay, which launches a couple of times a year, because that's where I teach how to do this work on a deeper level. So thank you for listening today. If this spoke to you at all, if it resonated with you, if it helped you, please share it with other parents. Please comment. I love to hear your comments. Thank you.